Well, good afternoon, everybody. Tori here from Overlook Horizon. Welcome to episode 1 of the Jetstreams and Rocket Dreams podcast here. I'm super excited today to get started with this. And I think we're going to have a pretty good day. We're going to go through and today we're talking about Starliner, the Boeing CFT 100 Starliner. And is the hate that Boeing gets really justified? Like, should we be hating on Boeing for what they've done with the Starliner so far? I don't know. We might be able to make a justification for that. Let's talk about it today. I'm excited to go through a little bit of the history, why we have Starliner, what Starliner's been able to accomplish so far, what has yet to be accomplished, how that compares to SpaceX, and we'll get into it here right now. This is Jetstreams and Rocket Dreams. All right, my name's Tori. This is Overlook Horizon here. I'll be your host for episode 1 today of Jetstreams and Rocket Dreams. Excited to try to do this a little bit more often. But I want to talk today about Starliner, the CFT 100 mission, specifically the crewed flight test that is hopefully happening here in another couple of days based on when I'm recording this. It should be next week, but we'll see if that actually happens. It's been a long time coming. Boeing has had a troubled past, not only with their space flights and their getting the crewed flights off the ground and getting astronauts to the International Space Station, but obviously they've had some pretty high-profile issues with their airplane division as well, and those kind of go hand in hand because it's just the Boeing name that everybody is hating on recently. I shouldn't say everybody, but it gets a lot of criticism. And I think a lot of the criticism is maybe justified. Maybe some of it is not. I guess it depends on where you're kind of coming from with that criticism. You know, it kind of all stems back to, for those that don't know, the commercial crew program, the beginning of it, way back in, say 2014 or so, when contracts were being awarded for the commercial crew program. You had Boeing, a historic, well-proven partner in spaceflight with the shuttle era, and it'd been a NASA partner for a very long time, big name, well-trusted, and along comes SpaceX submitting a bid to fly astronauts with this rocket that had only been around for a couple of years and the name that had only been around for a couple of years. And, at the time there was a little bit of criticism that, why SpaceX? What are we including SpaceX for astronauts for? SpaceX we can't trust them to launch astronauts. And so that was kind of the mentality way back in 2014. There were a lot of people that really didn't think that SpaceX was even going to be able to keep up with NASA's rigorous safety and certification standards. The William Gerstenmayer, Associate Administrator for Human Exploration and Operations, said way back in 2014 that he was pretty skeptical about SpaceX's ability to keep up with the safety and certification standards, especially within the timeline that SpaceX was proposing. They were coming along saying, well, we're going to do things a whole lot faster, and we're also going to bid a lot lower. And so we're going to do it faster, we're going to do it cheaper, and we're going to be more successful at flying astronauts. And people were going, well, I don't know about that. We'll give you a try, maybe. And but Boeing is Boeing. They're going to be the partner that's going to do it for us. That was 10 years ago, 2014. Fast forward now, and you've got SpaceX just launched Crew 8, their 8th official crewed mission, 9 if you count DM2, but Crew 8, their 8th operational crewed mission. So they've now flown astronauts to the International Space Station quite a few times. And Starliner is really just getting started with launching astronauts. They haven't actually gotten started yet. And I don't mean to be overly critical myself about Boeing, because I do think in the long run, having two partners is good for the U.S. space program. So this whole thing with the Commercial Crew Program came about way back, even before 2014. With the only way we were getting astronauts to the International Space Station or into low Earth orbit at all, for that matter, was on a Soyuz rocket, a Russian Soyuz rocket. And obviously the U.S. and Russia have, not always been besties. So the idea was, well, we need to get our own space program in place that replace the shuttle. The shuttle has been retired. We need our own way to get astronauts into low Earth orbit. We need to kind of look to the future. What can we do? We'll select a provider of our own to launch. But there was this problem of, well, if something goes wrong or there's any sort of delay, we need to make sure there's a second option so that our programs aren't delayed for years and years. And from a national security or national interest standpoint, like that's just not good for the U.S. in general to only be able to launch astronauts on one platform. And so I think very much in 2014 the concept was, well, Boeing's gonna be our launch provider, but we'll bring SpaceX into the fold so we have a second option, just in case kind of thing. And they were both awarded 6 flights, so it was kind of a 50-50 kind of deal. But there were a lot of people that thought that Boeing was the provider, and SpaceX is the second choice. Charlie Bolden, the NASA administrator, said in 2014 that he had a preference for Boeing's established track record over SpaceX's newer presence. The evaluation board that was determining what providers they would select going forward preferred and scored Boeing a lot higher than SpaceX. And so I think a lot of the criticism now about Boeing, a lot of it stems back to kind of a, like, I told you so kind of thing with SpaceX being so successful. It's almost like we're critical now to point our finger at the people in the past, say that, all of us now, well, we knew that SpaceX was going to be successful. I mean, none of us knew, but a lot of us hoped and really, really wanted it to be SpaceX was exciting at the time, launching and trying to land first stage boosters and things like that. So it's kind of a finger pointing, obviously something we get to do retroactively now, but I do still think it's good in the end. And some of this competition of having two providers, we're actually seeing the benefits of it now with the delays in Boeing. So, I mean, it sounds kind of weird, but you get a company like SpaceX that comes along that says they're going to do things faster and cheaper, and then they do. There's a lot of pressure on Boeing to kind of figure it out and start. Obviously, you don't want to cut corners. You don't want to skip safety steps. You can't do that. But, the initial thing is, it was, can SpaceX really do this safely? Can they go this fast and do it safely? Well, now here we are 10 years later, and they've proven that they can do it safely. They can do it that fast. And it now with this two provider thing gives us the option to kind of look at Boeing and put a little bit of pressure on them to say, like, listen, we want you to do it safe, and we want all the steps to be taken. But, SpaceX is going a lot faster. Like, what's the deal? Can we figure this out? And so that's where I think some of the criticism is justified. That you can, if it's done in the spirit of competitiveness and to make both programs better, I would never. I don't think it's a good idea for us to eliminate one provider and say, like, you know what, SpaceX is our provider. We're just gonna, Boeing, thanks for trying. SpaceX is our provider. I don't think that's a good idea. I definitely don't think it's a good idea for us to say to Boeing that they're the provider. I think it's good to have two providers. And at some point, maybe Boeing gets it together and starts really nailing down the astronaut launches and the crewed launches. And maybe they start putting pressure on SpaceX if something happens and SpaceX is kind of lulled into a sense of security, a sense of complacency or things like that. The competitive nature of having two providers, I think, is good. I think it's good in the long run. And now we don't have to rely on the Soyuz spacecraft. The Soyuz doesn't have to be our backup. The U.S. has two options here, and hopefully in a couple of days that will finally be the case after Boeing launches. And a lot of the criticism also comes from the beginning of the commercial crew program. I think Boeing was awarded something like $4 billion for the Starliner project, and SpaceX came in at $2 billion, almost half the cost. And like I said, a lot of people didn't think that was realistic. They were, how are you going to do it for $2 billion? How are you going to do it that fast? And it turns out they're doing pretty well with it. So moving forward to kind of the commercial crew program here now, or the crewed flight test that is coming up now for Boeing. How did we get here? So initially, they had to do an orbital flight test, or OFT. That was something that that is something that they did in 2019. Starliner launched on OFT. Originally, it was just called OFT because it was supposed to be the only OFT, or orbital flight test. Now it's called OFT-1 because, spoiler alert, there is an OFT-2. But OFT-1 was supposed to be the equivalent of SpaceX's Demo 1, which was an uncrewed test to launch to the International Space Station, autonomously dock with the ISS, re-enter, land, basically a complete dress rehearsal with no astronauts on board. And SpaceX did Demo 1, went great, but and at the time, Starliner and SpaceX were really neck and neck. It was a really kind of a nail biter. Who was going to be the first ones to launch astronauts as a commercial provider to the International Space Station? So they were neck and neck. Maybe there was a little bit of pressure on Starliner to kind of hurry things up and keep up with SpaceX, because OFT-1 had an issue, a big issue actually, an anomaly, software anomaly that meant that they could not dock with the International Space Station. So they launched, and there was a software anomaly where the mission clock that handed off the mission clock. Let's see if I can remember this correctly. The mission clock from the launch vehicle, when it handed off to Starliner, was not in sync. So Starliner was in orbit, but thought that it was at a different phase of the mission. And so it was doing all sorts of unnecessary burns because it didn't know what part of the mission it was in. And so it ended up consuming way too much fuel. If I remember correctly, it was also in a communication gap with maybe the TDRS satellites communication. So ground controllers didn't realize for an extended period of time, not super extended, but long enough where they didn't realize that it was having this anomaly until it was too late, until it had burned up too much fuel, and now Starliner didn't have enough fuel to get to the ISS because it doesn't launch straight from the ground. It's not a straight line from the ground to the International Space Station. Needs some fuel once it gets into orbit to kind of raise its orbit, do the docking maneuvers, all that kind of stuff, and come back, obviously. And it had used up so much fuel doing these unnecessary thruster adjustments because it thought it was in a different part of the mission and was trying to correct it because it wasn't in the right place for the time of the mission that it thought it was at. So it had used up too much fuel. And so turns out OFT-1 couldn't make it to the International Space Station and had to come back. I mean, it's not a complete loss. Obviously, it still goes through launch, goes through re-entry, goes through some on-orbit operations, comes back, lands safely, and that was, a partial success. Obviously, the main portion of the mission wasn't successful. So that was a big problem. So that's 2019. OFT-2 then was 2022. So it was a while that they had to kind of sort out some of the issues with the software issues and get themselves ready. Then OFT-2, that also had multiple delays with some of the propulsion system valves and had to do a lot of software testing to make sure there was no further issues that were going to that were going to happen. This is now an additional expense to Boeing. They weren't planning on doing an entire second test flight. So now they got to do they got to do an extensive review. They got to do another test flight, make sure everything goes well. This one goes a whole lot better. All right. They're able to dock to the International Space Station. And now fast forward 2024, we're ready to launch Crew. So they're launching 2 astronauts to the ISS, Barry Wilmore or Butch Wilmore and Sunita Williams or Sunny Williams. Both of them very experienced astronauts. They got previous space flights under their belt. So, they're test pilots in this. They're the only 2 astronauts that will be on board. This is similar to Bob and Doug that were on Demo 2 for SpaceX. And now we're right there. We're ready to launch, but we've got some delays. Now, these delays here, I'm not super critical about Boeing for these particular delays because these are now kind of safety delays that you would expect to see on launch day, right? They're supposed to launch on May 6th. That was 10 days ago from today. And they had the astronauts on board. They had an issue with a pressure regulation valve. And they also now have a helium leak in the service module. These are, I think, things that they're going to resolve, and we'll potentially have another launch attempt here on the 21st. But there is a big difference, and I think this is potentially where we could see a difference in the 2 platforms, right? So another criticism of SpaceX was this idea of load and go, right? So SpaceX launches their rockets in what's called a load and go method, meaning they put all the astronauts on board, they strap them in, they suit them up, they seal up the capsule, they activate or arm the launch escape system, critical step there, and then they fuel the rocket. And that took a lot of people criticized that, the load and go system is like, oh, that's dangerous. Why would you do that? Because the whole bit of fueling the rocket, right? There's all kinds of pressure changes happening. You're flowing fuel into the rocket. That's considered kind of like one of the more dangerous aspects of preparing to launch is when you're fueling the rocket, right? We're actively trying to put fuel in the rockets, as opposed to the kind of tried and true method, or the quote unquote safer method, what people thought was the safer method, which was fuel the rocket, get it into a stable scenario where maybe we're just venting off excess pressure that might build up. And then when it's stable, we'll put astronauts on board. That way we're not messing with fueling the rocket while astronauts are sitting there waiting for launch. I've never really understood this personally, or this criticism, because honestly, the SpaceX method, like once you talk about it for 5 seconds, at least in my opinion, the SpaceX option seems like the safer option, right? The big caveat there being that the launch escape system is armed the entire time. So like you walk up to a vehicle, the SpaceX vehicle, and there's no fuel on board anywhere. All the crew people, the pad support people, the astronauts, they're all interacting with a rocket. There's no fuel anywhere. And they get on there. I mean, I guess there's technically some, the launch escape system has some fuel, but for the most part, the rocket itself is not filled to capacity with fuel. So you get all the astronauts on, you activate the launch escape or arm the launch escape system rather. And now at this point, now everybody leaves. All the pad support people leave. Astronauts stay, obviously. But at this point, if anything goes wrong, you've got a launch escape system that's armed and can pull the astronauts away. That's always made more sense to me. And this whole idea of waiting to put the astronauts on until the fuel is stable, I don't know, that never really made sense, because if anything ever went wrong, like you've got pad support people there, you've got astronauts there that are interactive, that are like, you can't do anything until they're safe, they're either safely in the capsule or the ground crews are safely away. So I don't know, the load and go method has always made more sense to me. But that was a big criticism of SpaceX. And where I was going with this, the big difference that we may see is now that you have astronauts on board and you're preparing for launch, you can't, if something happens during that period, right, it's relatively routine once the fuel is stable and now you're just venting it off. There is still that venting that has to happen, and there's valves involved with that. And if anything's going wrong, the launch teams can't really be messing with the rocket, cycling valves or changing parameters while the crew is trying to ingress into the vehicle, right? So you have this window of this period where you can't touch it. And that seems more, maybe I'm oversimplifying it, but that seems more dangerous to me. And what it seems like is that could lead to more scrubs, right? Because if they do start to see something where they're like, oh, geez, this, the Atlas V it certainly has a almost flawless record launching, right? So we had a small anomaly one time where the engine shut down, the first stage engine, RD-180 engine shut down early, like 5 seconds early. And that's like the only issue that the Atlas V has ever had. So it's a platform where you're like, oh, well, of course we're going to use the Atlas V. It's such a proven launch vehicle, but proven because they can prepare it for launch and they can toggle things and reset valves and cycle them and mess with stuff before launch. Well, now you introduce astronauts and all of a sudden this is a much different animal here. You can't really go messing with stuff while astronauts are trying to ingress into the vehicle. And so I wonder, the question that I have is that, are we going to have more scrubs with the Starliner low or fueling sequence because of that? Because if you get to the point where astronauts are trying to ingress, which is not an instant thing, right? It takes some time. Astronauts are trying to ingress into the vehicle and we're seeing something that maybe we don't like on our gauges. I say we, like I'm part of the launch team, but maybe they're seeing something they don't like. Well, the option there is like, you can't just keep the astronauts and the ground personnel around. So at that point, now you got to scrub. You got to get them out of there, or you got to do some sort of long delay, but you got to get it safe before you can start messing with things. And so now you got to get the astronauts and the ground people out of there so you can mess with stuff. And at that point, right, we're launching with the International Space Station. We have a launch window that we have to hit. It's not like we can just, say, well, we'll try it again in a couple hours. Well, in a couple hours, space station's not going to be where it's supposed to be. So we got to scrub for the day. So are we going to see more scrubs because of this method? I don't know. Obviously, the space shuttle had it figured out, but was the space shuttle, I don't know. My memory, I was a lot younger then, and I didn't really pay that close of attention of how many times we were scrubbing, but space shuttle certainly had its scrubs. So I don't know. I'm not sure. I'm not sure if that's something that will become an issue. Obviously, time is going to tell. Time is going to tell for that. So I like our chances of getting a successful launch. It's not like we had a bunch of things go wrong. It was a small minor thing. So I'm thinking that this coming, Tuesday, the 21st, we could very well have a good attempt at the next crewed flight test launch. So astronauts, the plan would be for the astronauts to go to the International Space Station. They're going to spend a week up there to make sure that everything is fine. They can kind of hang out for a bit. I believe the Starliner has the ability to stay there for up to 6 months in case there is some sort of issue that they can't come home right away. But they're obviously not expecting to do anything like that. And then they'll come home and land, and hopefully we have a successful mission, and they'll go on to regular operational crewed missions. And I really do hope that it is successful. I mean, again, the central theme here is Boeing, is the criticism of Boeing really justified? I think to some extent, I think I would answer yes. Some of the criticism is justified. And a lot of it, again, stems from, it's almost like we're criticizing Boeing because there was so much criticism of SpaceX originally. Some of it is too with like the commercial airplane issues, 737 MAX, stuff like that. People are criticizing Boeing because I don't know. I don't really tie the two together. Commercial airplane division and the spaceflight division, they're two separate divisions. They're two separate managers or management teams. I don't think they're really related. They're almost like two separate companies. They just share the Boeing name. I don't think they're really related at all. I could be proven wrong, but I don't really factor in. I don't draw connections between the airplane division and the spaceflight division. I think they operate completely independently. So I'm hoping for a successful flight here on Tuesday, the 21st. I think it will be I think it'll be pretty good. And ultimately, we want two providers. We want two spaceflight providers to launch astronauts to the International Space Station in the long run here. So I think that's where I'm going to wrap up and end it here. That's my thoughts on our upcoming Starliner crewed flight tests, hopefully coming up on May 21st, 2024. Come back here after May 21st and re-listen or watch the episode and let me know in the comments if it actually happened on the 21st. I don't know. We'll find out together and see if we can have this go off. So that's episode 1, Jetstreams and Rocket Dreams. If you like this kind of format, let me know. Give me some feedback. Follow me on Twitter, OLHCN on Twitter, or the Facebook or TikTok or our YouTube channel for Overlook Horizon. Wherever it is, come find us. Let me know if this is a format that you'd like to see more of. Because I had some fun. I just kind of hanging out and chatting away. It feels like a whole lot less pressure than what I usually do for creating YouTube videos. So we're going to try this out for a little while. My name's Tori. This is Overlook Horizon, the Jetstreams and Rocket Dreams podcast. Episode 1 is over. Thanks everybody for joining. We'll see you on the next one. Goodbye.